Welcome to the Low Demand Parenting Podcast, where we drop the pressure, find the joy, and thrive, even when it feels like life is stuck on level 12 hard. I'm Amanda Diekman, author, autistic adult, and mom of 3. I'm not here as an expert, but a fellow traveler. Together, we're learning how to live more gently, authentically, and vibrantly in this wild parenting life. I'm really honored to be here with my online friend and now real life friend, Emma Svanberg. Welcome, Emma.
Hello, thank you. It's so nice to be here and be talking to you like this.
I know, it really is. One of my favorite things about being more honest and transparent about my parenting journey has been finding friends who get it and who share so much life experience. And you're one of them. And we're here to talk about some of that today. Before we launch into a robust conversation about grief, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you began writing and teaching and reflecting about parenting as a particular stage of life that deserves care and love and attention?
So I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I always specialised in attachment. Like, my area of interest was always attachment strategies, attachment relationships, the way in which our early relationships and life experiences can shape our later relationships and how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about our place in the world. Through that, so I came into infant mental health as my kind of first love, so thinking about the parent-infant bond. And then I think over time, it really expanded out into thinking about the pressure that so many parents feel that they have on themselves. Because in my years of kind of training and working with parents, the thing that has changed the most is the amount of information that parents have about the purpose of parenting, about the impact that parenting can have on children and on human development. And with that has come for a lot of parents a huge amount of anxiety about whether they're getting it right, whether they're messing up their kids, the kind of feelings of shame and failure that are so prevalent for a lot of parents, and feel a lot like some of the solutions that we found to those problems are really just amplifying that anxiety even further. And that's why I'm such a big fan of the kind of low demand, low pressure, all of the kind of, I don't know, there's a sort of push towards life that feels a bit simpler, family life that feels more authentic, that is more about being in relationship with your children. And as part of that, really having to get to know yourself so that you can show up as you really are. And I think that new wave that is growing at the moment, I find really exciting, because actually that's what we have to do as parents, right? We just have to be ourselves and treat our children as themselves and help them to navigate this really complicated world that we live in.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how grief and parenting intersect and how navigating our own grief stories reshapes our parenting stories.
I think that we all parents experience grief to some extent, and we all have our different versions of that in terms of being the parents that we thought we would be versus the parents that we actually are, and also having the child or children that we thought we would have versus the actual child that we do have in front of us. And then also everything that comes with that, our partner not being the person that we expected them to be, or not showing up in the way that we had fantasized about. If you think about grief and the kind of grief of losing your ideal parenting fantasy, it is a fantasy, let's name it as that happens at the same time as you're actually navigating the demands of parenting and the challenges of actually looking after a child or children while doing that within the context that you're in. That is an incredibly tough thing to do, and we're often doing it without very much support, both practical and emotional support. We're also then doing it in the face of a counter narrative, which says that we're supposed to be fine with all of this. We're supposed to be coping. And if you're not coping, then it's your fault. It's a real double-edged sword, because we have our own internal idealized narrative, our fairy tale. And that's different for everybody, but there will be similarities in people's stories. But then when we start to come up against that, the difference between our ideal and our reality, we're then hit by that second really difficult realizing of, and we're not supposed to feel like this. So to give yourself permission to both feel those feelings and then start to confront them and think about, if life is not like that, then why is that? And if it's not my failing, then what am I going to do with that? What could it be? Or how could life be different? And those questions, I'm just saying it like that, but these are big existential questions that make us test our identity, our place in the world. They make us question, am I cut out for this parenting thing? Should I have had children with this partner who is not the person that I thought they were? Should I have had children in this world that we live in that is crazy and chaotic? So we're talking about things that feel bite size. Like, it's very easy for me to sit here and say, hey, all you need to do is challenge your idealized narrative and tell yourself that it's okay to do that. Actually, the reality of doing that is so very difficult because it often involves a lot of grief, a lot of pain, a lot of looking back at our previous experiences, why we formed those expectations in the first, but also not having the space to do that. We don't have the space to ask those big questions when we're parents. We're never parenting in a vacuum. We're doing so many different things at the same time. So to have to ask these big identity questions while we're still trying to keep a household going, trying to keep a job going, trying to keep our relationship or partnership going, trying to have a social life, all of these things, it's really difficult. And often, let's face it, with quite a lot of judgment about the kind of decisions that we might be making or the questions that we're asking. So that it's a lot. And how could there not be grief involved in that? Because we're talking about shifting our identity, shifting how we feel about this really important relationship in our lives that we see as a role, as a job. And we're doing all of that in a way and in a position where we don't really have the space and time to do it, and where everything around us is telling us, don't do that, just get on with it, just do what you're supposed to be doing. It's a lot.
Yes. I'm thinking of if we could slow down time a little bit, it would be helpful for parents. It's every moment holds so much, and there's this racing feeling of one thing to the next. Like there's always another meal coming, and always another water bottle that needs refilling, and another tech device that's running out of batteries. And somehow in all of that, there are these huge waves of grief. We can't actually slow down time, but you and I right now, we can pretend to. So if we could, what would be some signs that a parent is experiencing grief underneath?
I think there's grief, there's shame. I think these are the kind of big feelings that we don't often address or acknowledge because they're painful. We don't really want to. We don't like to go there. I think that often when we're feeling those kind of really tricky, difficult emotions, that we might notice feelings of resentment, snappiness and irritability. That's something that will come out. Often it's not around the thing that you're feeling grief about or the sense of loss that you have. It's just this accumulation of stress that happens over time that might be to do with grief. It might be to do with feelings of shame that actually you're not really enjoying this today, or you didn't respond to that in the way that you wanted to. I think that what we tend to do and what we're often very good at doing is putting on our kind of front, our brave face, showing up in the way that we feel like we should. For me, there's something about the distance growing between how we're feeling on the inside and what we're showing on the outside that is often a sign that there's something going on. There's some questions that need to be thought about. There's something that needs to be addressed even before you get to the point of resentment or before you get to the point of being irritated or snappy. I think that we can often feel that disconnect through a feeling like we're just going through the motions. We're in a bit of a trance maybe, or on autopilot. You're doing all the things. You're filling up the water bottle. You're plugging in the devices. You're answering the 10,000 mummies. But actually, you're just going through the motions. You don't really feel like you're present. I will say, because I think that idea of presence can also add pressure to people, there is nobody on earth who is present all of the time. We cannot do that. We need to also have our own kind of mental space. And it's a very natural and normal thing to drift off at times into daydreams or into something that just feels a bit different, or to be preoccupied with the other things that you've got to do, got to think about. If you're doing that all the time, you feel like you're never quite present in your experience, your head is often elsewhere. When you're under a lot of stress for a long time, is often not that we get irritated, it's actually that we dissociate. We move away from our bodies, we move away from our situation, because that feels easier on our system than actually staying present and being there in that moment. Often that can then lead to suddenly those emotions will enter your body again at a time of real stress. So there might be something that just tips you back into feeling all of that stress in your body, feeling that shame, feeling that grief, feeling that guilt. And then you might explode or burst into tears or storm out of the room. And often we can then go, wow, where did that come from? That was unexpected. But it's because we were so distant that we weren't able to feel our feelings, because we were just coping. We were just getting on in that survival state. A lot of parents have been in that state for a long time, especially with the pandemic and lockdowns, and often parents having to be with their children 24/7 in a way that they didn't have to be before COVID. So, or having to navigate their children's very natural, big emotional expressions about their own grief, about what has happened over the last few years and how difficult the world can feel at times. So when we're holding all of that, it's really adaptable to go into that survival state. That's how we keep going. When we keep doing that day in, day out, it can start to wear down our own systems. You talk a lot about the nervous system, and when we're parenting children who are in that kind of heightened high arousal nervous system state a lot of the time, actually you do very naturally go into a more dissociated place, because you're firefighting. If you're firefighting a lot, then you have to create a bit of distance, because you don't want to have a big emotional reaction in response to your child. But it's really important that at some point we go back to ourselves, we tune back in, and we think about what we've been pushing down, because it does. Inevitably, it has to come out sooner or later, whether that's at our child, whether that's we ourselves just fall to pieces, or we end up traumatized ourselves, as you've spoken about before. The kind of sheer amount of load that we're putting on our systems needs to be looked at some point.
Yeah, something that I wanted to hear you
Yes.
talk about that feels to me like a particularly toxic area of all the shoulds and all the expectations around parenting is the idea of calm, that we're supposed to remain
Mm-hmm.
calm at all times, and that the
Mm.
goal is to be calm. I have a lot of feelings about that. I imagine you do too. So, what do you see as the impact of the pressure to remain calm, and what's the way out of it?
I can see where it comes from. I'm joking. Who decided that we need to be calm? But if you think about the pendulum swing, I often think about this pendulum swing in parenting culture and parenting trends. And what I write about a lot in Parenting for Humans is that idea that when we move away from something, we often do go a little bit too far in the other direction. That's the pendulum swing, until we can swing back to something that actually feels sustainable and, let's say, authentic. Most people who are parenting nowadays were raised in authoritarian households. That was the prevailing parenting culture of that time, the 80s and 90s. And then into the kind of 90s, early noughties, that was very much about individualism, success, achievement. A lot of that is high pressure, high demand. And now we've swung into what nowadays is the predominant prevailing sort of culture around parenting, which is gentle parenting. I would like to be able, as a parent, to allow my child to fully express their emotions, to be able to receive them, and to be able to regulate with them and neatly package them back and give them back to my child. So that's how they're going to learn to express their emotions. But what we never really talk about is, how do you do that if you never had the opportunity to do that for yourself? How do you do that if actually your message was the opposite? Don't have that emotion, because you're just going to go to your room and suppress that emotion. So that's how why we learn to dissociate, right? You just pack it down, or you blow up at something else, but you don't think and carefully process your emotions and then be able to talk about them. And maybe if we've done our work, we might be able to talk about it with an adult who is able to be calm and co-regulate with us and is able to hear our emotional expression. But for me, there's something that is really challenging. It is like the challenge of our time, I think, if the parents are trying to parent in an attuned, compassionate way when they're faced with their children's really big emotions, to then be able to soak that up, which is what we're the kind of co-regulation, that's what we're doing. We're soaking up that child's big emotions. And because we're not then thinking about our own emotional reaction to that, we're being able, we're containing it, we're internalizing some of it, we're reflecting back to them, this is what I think you're going through, or we're just soothing them. And then later on, we're going to talk about what it is that they're going through. Nowhere in that equation is, and what do we do with the part of us that goes, oh my God, this is overwhelming. So I think that's a very natural response to, actually, I don't know what to do with the distance between what I experienced and what I'm supposed to be doing now as a parent. I need to dissociate a little bit so that I can take in these emotions, these big emotions from my child. And then I need to somehow be able to support them through these emotions. I don't know how to do that for myself. So I'm just going to put on my calm face, pretend that everything's fine. And then we're just going to get on and life's going to be happy and it's all going to be okay. It does create this nervousness in your body. That is a kind of nervous energy that comes in because you're bringing in a lot of tension and stress that you don't really know what to do with. You haven't had the skills or the resources. No one's taught you what do you do with that. And then your child picks up on that distance between how you're actually feeling on the inside and what you're showing on the outside. And very astute children, and autistic children often are very astute, will say, hang on, your facial expression and your tone do not match. So what's going on? And you then have to make that choice. Right? I need to figure out what's going on because they can see it. I don't know what's going on with me, but they can see it. As you said earlier, this is our learning opportunity to go, if my children are seeing something in me that I don't understand, that I don't recognize, that feels quite painful and quite difficult, how am I going to figure out what that thing is that is causing this mismatch that my child is picking up on? Again, it's a big challenge. It's not an easy thing to do. But I think this is where those sort of children who are sensitive to our nervous systems, they can be such a gift to us because they force us to have to look at what we're hiding, even from ourselves, because they see all of it. I think that self-compassion, when we talk about it, usually in parenting, we can talk about compassionate phrases, or we can talk about acceptance or being kind to yourself. For me, there's something about allowing yourself time. If you have a lot of big feelings, and like we talked about before, wouldn't it be amazing if we could slow things down so that we have space to process some of this? We can slow things down, and we can also model to our children, I need this to slow down because there's a lot going on here. Especially if we are somebody who experiences a lot of emotion very quickly all at once, and it takes a while for us to untangle that. And we might have a child who is similar, which is why we're starting to unpack all of that for ourselves. It's a really compassionate thing for both of you to be able to say, there's a lot going on for me right now, and I'm going to not say anything, and I'm just going to take a few moments to try and figure out what's happening. And it just gives us permission, and it gives our children permission to not know, because that's the other side, I think, of the kind of calm parenting, that we're supposed to know. We're supposed to know how we're feeling. But if we're feeling a lot all at once, and if we haven't really had the skills or the resources or somebody teaching us how do you label your emotions and what do you do with those emotions once you know what they are, it can just feel like a bombardment. This is, again, one of those things we don't always talk about as parents when we're supposed to be loving parents all the time. But occasionally, and especially if we're parenting in a very different way from the way that we were raised, there can be a little kid that sort of just comes up on us and goes, hang on a second, I would never have got away with that. Or how dare they speak to you like that? You would never have got away with that.
Yes.
And I think that being able to take a pause in the moment, not feel like you have to do anything at all, and even that can be really powerful for everybody in the family. Just actually, we're just going to be here. We're not going to fix anything. We're just going to be together. There has to then be a point where we are compassionate to that little kid in us and we go, yeah, I'm really sorry that you didn't get that. And how amazing that you are now giving this, your adult self is now giving this to somebody else. But what are you left with in the fact that there is this longing in you to have received some of that too? And we can give that to ourselves, right? And that again feeds into that sense of grief.
Yes.
What can so often come up in our parenting is the feeling of loss for the childhood that we really wish that we'd had. And sometimes the real longing that to have had the childhood that we're really trying to give to our children.
Mhm.
So that kind of grief of, oh, I really wish I'd had that, is something that we can recognize for ourselves and give that to ourselves in some way, just by words of compassion or kindness or understanding, or even just acknowledging, yeah, it was really different. It was really different for you. And I'm sorry that you didn't receive that.
Yes, absolutely. Something I'm just learning to do is to say also to myself, and what do I need now in light of the fact
Mm,
that I didn't receive that when I was a kid? That
yeah.
yes, it is too late to go back. I cannot redo my childhood. I can't go back and create the childhood I never wanted, but I can have the adulthood that I deserve.
Yeah.
And that reframe has been very empowering for me so that my grief can also show up as activation. This is work you do in your book as well, just acknowledging how our struggles to show up in the moment with our children have everything to do with the privileges and marginalizations that we occupy in the world, the completely broken and inadequate systems that are meant to support us as parents and which are not. What would you want for parents to hear and to know about more of the broader scale questions? That it's not just us. So many people feel like it's
Mm,
only me, I'm the only one, and that this is actually a broad systemic failure of all of us.
mm.
What does that bring up for you?
Makes me think about community, the importance of community, because I think one of the biggest failures of this way of parenting, the way that we parent in the modern world, in the Western world anyway, is that we're parenting in isolation. And if we're parenting children who have any kind of additional need, then we're often parenting in even more isolation while feeling very different and other from other parents around you. I think there's something that can be so powerful about finding community, which is something that you do through your work. It's also something that I think is happening increasingly as people start to question the impact of the systems around them in their different spaces. So finding other people who have that shared experience, which in itself can reverse that sensation of loneliness and isolation. It lifts some of the grief because you realize that it's not just you, it's something that it's a shared experience. And it also galvanizes change because often it's within community that we can then draw on each other's power, draw on each other's strengths, and think about how we want things to be different. And I think we're seeing that now. Like, definitely in England, we're seeing that at the moment with this increasing movement of parents saying, actually, the current education system is really failing our children and failing marginalized groups even more, but really failing all children to some extent and failing the teachers and the education staff. That can only happen through people coming together and hearing this is our shared experience. So I think being able to do that, being able to grieve together and be able to feel that sense of something not having happened in the way that you really wanted it to can then allow you to push through that into action, into change, into if this system isn't working, what are we going to do to create a system that works for us? And that's the bit that's really exciting to me, that we can do that together and that we don't need a lot around us to do that. There's something about how powerful it can be when families together just come together in a group and create amazing, magical new systems in the way that they need.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Emma, for speaking to us today of so many things that go unsaid. I love that you are using both your training and your lived experience to bring an entire generation of parents' reality into the known world. You're speaking our truth. And I truly loved your book, and I wanted to put that in here, that Parenting for Humans is an incredible resource, like nothing else I've read in the parenting world. Thank you for writing it.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. Thank you for reading it.
If this podcast is speaking to your soul, you can subscribe through wherever you get your own podcasts. Even better, if you feel the nudge, head on over to Apple Podcasts in particular and leave us a review. It's such a helpful way for new people to also get to experience what this podcast wants to bring into their lives. I'm Amanda. Remember, it takes great strength to let things go. I'll see you next week.